and he will talk about AI and the challenge of creative spontaneity.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. I think that by now we know that there are many interesting, both practical and theoretical questions within this intersection of creativity and AI. For example, the question of plagiarism or authorship of AI-generated content, its educational usefulness. I think we heard something about that last night if you went to the concert. And on the more theoretical spectrum, we have whether the use of AI can enhance our creativity or maybe diminish it. But I think that primarily for our interest here for this conference, we have two important questions. The first one was how creative is generative AI? And that's the one that appears in, I guess, the official title of the conference. But then in some of Sebastian's emails, we also get this second one. Can AI be creative? And I think that's a more primary or fundamental question. And the way I would pose it is, can AI be genuinely creative and under what conditions? I guess we all agree that it appears to be creative, but what genuine creativity includes is still an open question, and I will discuss that one for the most part. But I will also, on the next slide, briefly discuss this other question of how creative is generative AI. My overall goal is to evaluate the best arguments pro and against AI creativity where the first or pro argument says that simply by the fact that AI is creating creative products, it is thereby creative. And the argument against would be the argument from spontaneity, which I will discuss later on. The approach that I have is to first offer an analysis of the concept of creativity. I think there are a few things that we can know about creativity without discussing it in connection with AI, and then apply that analysis to AI. So how creative is generative AI? Well, this is the question about the measure of creativity in AI, and when we ask about how creative something is, we are close to a psychological approach to creativity, because psychologists are mostly interested in these quantifiable measures of creativity, and they developed a number of tests that show us how creative a person is. By what they mean by creativity is divergent thinking, convergent thinking, and perhaps some self-evaluating judgments. So in divergent thinking, we have the fact that we are able to, for example, take an object and think of all the ways in which we could use it. And these tests are asking or assessing how many answers we give, the quality of those answers, the mutual relationship between those answers. And with convergent thinking, we have that there is usually one answer, but you have to connect some disparate things to come up with an answer. And how does generative AI compare to humans when doing these tests? Well, it usually scores in the top 1% of humans. So by this measure, it would be much, much more creative than we are. Of course, still some of the most impressive or most important creative achievements are made by humans, but at least using these tests, AI seems to be highly creative. But I think that when we ask how creative it is, we are presupposing that it is creative. And this gives us the segue to a more fundamental or deeper structure of creativity that we have to explore. And here I want to give a minimal analysis, sorry, of what is needed to have creativity. And we already heard this often used definition, which is also called standard definition, cited in Dorde in her 1990 book, but also in some recent articles, and very much used by psychologists. It says that creativity is the ability to create new, surprising, and valuable products. But as I think Alessandro has mentioned, this is too much of a focus on the product. And there are other elements of creativity, or aspects, or dimensions, as some scholars call them, which would be the process and the agent. And so to understand creativity as a whole, we have to include those elements as well. So let me say a few things about the creative product first before I come to process and the agent. So a creative product has to be new and valuable. I think we probably have, as a most basic notion of creativity, that a person who is creative creates something new, something, I guess, unexpected. But we are able to create new things which are completely random and don't have any value. So value is also an essential feature of a creative product. About newness, it can be psychologically new, that is new to us, even though it already exists elsewhere. But there are also cases of historical creativity, when something is just radically new and never done before. What kinds of values are those in virtue of which an object is creative? Well, usually those are intellectual and aesthetic values. I'm not sure about the moral values and economic values or other types, but usually we think that there is some connection to the world of the idea that is creative, perhaps some aesthetic qualities, or maybe it's a coherent idea or something like that. And also there are aesthetic values, which I won't get into, but you understand what that refers to. And I will later on discuss the objective or subjective nature of these values. And also this distinction between intellectual and aesthetic values somehow roughly corresponds to two types of products that we call creative. Those will be ideas and artifacts, and two types of social activities, science and art, also roughly corresponds to this distinction. Okay, that's about the creative product. What is the creative process? What does it involve? Well, I think this is the part which makes creativity interesting and somewhat mysterious. There are these eureka moments when something sort of unexpectedly happens and a brilliant scientist comes up with an idea, or an artist invents a style or something like that. But I think that we shouldn't think of this creative process in this too magical of a way. It has these three components, it seems to me. They would be the cognitive causal component, which is based on cognitive mechanisms, which we also use in everyday life in other activities like language processing and deliberation and so on. Those would be association, analogy, metacognition, self-reflection, logical reasoning as well. And those are the things that produce the product in actuality. But there's also a phenomenological component, which I think is also quite important, essential actually. And it is the lack of factual knowledge of the essential features of the end product or the method by which we come to that end product. So when you ask yourself, when you paint something or you're writing a paper, do you know the end product? Do you know what you're going to say or how the picture is going to look like? Maybe roughly, but most of the time we don't know. We discover that ourselves through that process. So there is a lack of factual knowledge of the essential features of that end product. Somebody else might know that. That's an interesting situation when a teacher is giving you a task to do, and he may know how you will do it because he has done it before, but you don't know that. And this lack of knowledge is important there. Or if you know the essential features of what you're going to create, then in order for that process to be creative, the method by which you come up to that end product should be unknown to you. There is also this final component, which I call the evaluative component, which includes the recognition of value of your work. It doesn't have to be the end of the creative process. It's something that happens throughout the process generally. So those are the features of the creative process. And finally, the creative agent. What do you have to possess? What properties does an agent who is creative possess? Well, I think these four are needed. Consciousness, and by consciousness, I don't mean self-consciousness or self-awareness. I simply mean the subjective first-person experience, like experience of pain. Intentionality is the aboutness of mental states and their relatedness to the world. We discussed that a little while ago. Proven creative disposition and intention. So this is different from intentionality. Intention is intending or willing to do. It's not something that happens to you. You have to want to make something creative. And there are also creative skills, general or domain-specific, which I won't get into, but those are these aspects of the creative agent. So how do these elements combine? That's actually what a theory of creativity, I think, should offer. And here's a way I think of it. So I think that the creative agent, by his intention, is the causal condition for the enactment of causal mechanisms which constitute the creative process, which then produces the creative product. However, I think that the direction of ontological grounding, so in virtue of what a process is creative, and then in virtue of what an agent is creative, is the fact that it is causally connected to the creative product. So it is the product and its newness and value that make all of the preceding factors creative. Now, why do I say that? Well, I think that all of these features of the agent and the process could lead to results or have uses that have nothing to do with creative production. So there is nothing specifically creative about some process in the mind that makes the creative product. So we have to make the product our basic ontological element. Also, another argument would be that a creative product has a relative ontological independence from the agent. Of course, it is causally dependent on the agent. However, to recognize that something is new and is valuable, we don't have to know under which conditions it arose. I've seen this on the wall, and I find it quite interesting. I'm not sure if it's a work by an artist or the wall just cracked. But in any case, it's interesting to me. Maybe it's not that new. I've seen those things before. But I could find some value in it, maybe find some interpretation. And this gives an object a kind of ontological independence. Also, I think that culture here is very important, but not in a factual sense. Some great works of art are not recognized. However, they would be recognized if they're true works of art. That's why I call this counterfactual evaluation by a wider culture. Okay, so what does this imply about AI? Well, can AI create new and valuable products? I think clearly yes, and that has been happening for decades, actually. So this creative version of the Turing test, when you don't know whether something was created by a human or AI, has been passed a long time ago. But that in itself doesn't make AI creative, as most people think that passing the Turing test, the original one, doesn't make it intelligent. It shows some conversational abilities, but true intelligence is something perhaps different. So this shows that this behaviorist argument that simply the fact of production is not enough. It has to arise through a right causal conditions. Can AI satisfy those conditions as well? I think that's a broader question. I think that we should be aiming for a mathematical model of both consciousness, intentionality, and these specific cognitive mechanisms that we use, and then try to see if they're at least isomorphic with what AI does. In that case, we could ascribe true creativeness to the process of the AI engages in, or to it as an agent. So that's my basic answer. It's still an open question, and it's not good to say it is or isn't creative. So far, we know that it isn't, most probably. But we should leave that question open. Maybe it can be, maybe it can satisfy these conditions as well. But you may think that there might be still another problem, even with this possibility that it satisfies all these conditions. And this is my application of the famous objection by Lady Ada Lovelace from 1843 to Charles Babbage's analytical machine. She says a computer cannot originate anything. It only follows instructions. It only does what we tell it to do. And we could say that it doesn't act spontaneously. So when we create something, it usually has this element of spontaneity. We don't really know how it happened. We just start writing or whatever we do. But there are different interpretations of this objection. Some scholars say that an AI cannot ask questions. That's really what's stopping it from being spontaneous. Other scholars focus on surprise and predictability, yet others mention determinism as this fact of them following rules as what is the problem. I think that there are successful replies to all of these interpretations, so I won't go into them. I think that the most pressing interpretation is probably the autonomy interpretation. An AI system cannot, by its very nature, initiate the causal process of creative action, even if it is an agent, while humans can. So this is how that picture would look like. We imagine that all of these conditions are satisfied. We imagine that a computer has a desire, conscious desire to create a musical composition, and it really does that as a composer would do it. However, it's still something that happens because I press a button as a human outside agent who initiates the process. And someone might say, this isn't true creativity, even if all of these conditions are met. I have two objections to this objection. I think that for minimal creativity, this strong sense of autonomy, of initiating the causal process, is not needed. There are many situations in which we are inspired by other people, urged, or we act upon a suggestion. And those events could very likely be similar to a person pressing a button. So for minimal creativity, this kind of autonomy isn't needed. This second objection is more controversial or speculative, I'm not sure. But I would say that we have a different view of looking at humans than machines, which might not be justified. So we feel a kind of discomfort about ourselves when we think of us as determined, as entities that have to do what we do. Whereas we think that spontaneity is not compatible with that. But if you're a compatibilist about any kind of freedom, including moral freedom and creative freedom, you have to see yourself, at least sometimes, as a deterministic machine. So this kind of disparity that exists is because we are led to disregard this perspective on ourselves and think of us in terms of desires and beliefs. Yet the full science of the brain might be more similar to the science of AI. And also, we assume a fully deterministic model for artificial intelligence, which might also be a presupposition that we could change. So I think this point kind of makes the autonomy objection a little bit weaker. So what is the conclusion? I think that current AI is probably not conscious. It probably doesn't have intentions, and so is not creative. However, there are no principled reasons for thinking that it cannot, at some point, achieve that. One bonus observation is about superintelligent AI. So if we imagine a kind of singularity that was talked so often, I think that likely it would know its own cognitive architecture, and it couldn't have this lack of knowledge of the end product or the method by which it is creating. Even if it does create the most creative products, it would lack the phenomenological component of the creative process, and in that case, it wouldn't be creative. So that's my ultimate conclusion, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thanks for the talk. Do you have some questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I have actually two questions. So the first one is about your thesis that there are creative works by AI, because there have been some suggestions in the literature that if we want to define the creative product, we also have to apply the conditions that we apply to the creative process. So there is something like new valuable plus process requirements. And I was just curious what you want to make about that. Like there have been obvious examples that if you look at the crack at the wall and you call that creative, once you learn that it was just by chance, it was just like a natural process, you wouldn't want to call it creative anymore. So I was wondering about that. And then the second one is about maybe more about spontaneity, because you mentioned this phenomenological component of the process. And I was just wondering, is this just phenomenological or is there more to it? Because there would be two ways of reconstructing it. So the first would be, it's just phenomenological, but in fact, you might be just following rules and they're just subconscious or unconscious and whatever. You don't know you're applying them. But there might also be more to it. Like, in fact, it is real spontaneity. Like there's something new you come up with, and even subconsciously you're not like following a rule or something. And I was wondering about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. Perhaps the example of the crack was not great, but imagine you see one of these images that were shown yesterday, I think, by AI, and you come in the room and you see that on the wall. You don't know who created it, but you find it's new and valuable. And I think that's the only part of the definition that matters for my theory here of what a creative product is. Maybe that's a little bit stretching to call it creative. I'm not sure. But that's how Boden creates them or terms them. So I follow that theory. Maybe they're not artworks. Maybe for art, we need this origin story as well to really appreciate it or to recognize its full aesthetic value, for example. But I think that in most cases, we are able to abstract from those conditions by which it arose and simply read a novel and take what it offers without knowing anything about how it was written, who wrote it, etc. So I get the point that sometimes we are looking for the process as well, but in most cases, we are still able to appreciate the value and find something new, even if we don't know about the process. And for spontaneity, I think you're right that it's precisely what I'm claiming. Maybe there are some unconscious rules, and it really is only in the phenomenology of this lack of knowledge of what we are going to end up creating or how we are going to do it. I'm not sure what would true spontaneity be. Would that be a kind of indeterminism, which probably shouldn't be equated with possible indeterminism on the quantum level? It's something that happens in the mind, yet it's not the lack of knowledge. I'm not sure what that even would be. So my, I guess, broader picture of a human being is that it is a deterministic system. And so it does follow some laws, at least. Maybe those are different from rules, I'm not sure. But I think these two notions are compatible.
Okay, thank you, George, again.
Thank you.
We are ready for the last